The letter arrived without warning, sealed with dark wax and carried by a writer who refused to say who sent it. Alina Hartley broke the seal with trembling fingers, standing in the doorway of the small rented room where her mother lay coughing behind a thin curtain. The words on the page made her heart stop. Duke Alaric Voss requests your presence at Voss Manor before sundown. Refusal is not an option you can afford. She read it twice, then a third time, searching for a mistake that was not there. She did not know the Duke. She had never set foot near his estate, had never spoken his name except in the same breath as rumors that traveled through the city like smoke, curling around every dinner table and market stall. He was a man people feared quietly, the kind of fear that made voices drop and eyes dart to the floor. Her mother stirred behind the curtain, her breathing shallow and wet. The physician had come the week before and given his verdict in a low, careful voice, the kind reserved for bad news. Weeks, he had said, perhaps less without proper medicine and rest neither of them could afford. Alina had spent every coin she owned, sold the last of her father's tools, and still it was not enough. She folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, feeling the wax seal dig into her palm. She had no choice, she never had. The carriage that came for her an hour later was black and unmarked, pulled by horses so well groomed they gleamed even in the fading light. Alina climbed inside without being asked twice, smoothing down her patched dress and trying to still the shake in her hands. The driver said nothing the entire ride. The city gave way to open road, then to iron gates taller than any building she had ever seen, and finally to the manor itself, a looming structure of gray stone and dark windows that seemed to watch her approach. A servant met her at the door, an older woman with sharp eyes and a face that revealed nothing. She introduced herself only as Mrs. Ellery and led Alina through hallways lined with portraits of stern faces long dead, their painted eyes following her every step. The air smelled of polished wood and something colder underneath, something Alina could not name but felt settle in her stomach like a stone. She was brought to a study at the end of a long corridor. The door opened before she could knock, and there he stood. Duke Alaric Voss was younger than she expected, though the years had carved something hard into his face, a tightness around the jaw that suggested he rarely smiled, and never without reason. His eyes were pale gray, the color of a sky before a storm, and they studied her the way a merchant studies a horse before deciding whether it is worth the price. "Sit," he said. It was not a request. Alina lowered herself into the chair across from his desk, spine straight despite the fear curling through her chest. She had learned long ago never to let fear show on her face, not to landlords who threatened to throw her and her mother into the street, not to merchants who cheated her on the price of thread, and not now, to a duke who held her mother's life somewhere in the folds of whatever plan had brought her here. "You are wondering why I sent for you," he said, settling into the chair behind his desk. "Alina Hartley, 22 years old, a seamstress by trade, though your mother tells the shopkeepers you were meant for finer things before your father died and left you both with nothing but debt." "How do you know about my mother?" she asked, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. "I make it my business to know things," he said simply. "Your mother is ill. Consumption, according to the physician who visited 3 days ago. She has perhaps 2 months if she is fortunate, less if she is not. You have spent everything you have trying to buy her more time, and it has not been enough." Alina's hands curled into fists in her lap. "Say what you want from me," she said. "Don't waste my time telling me what I already know." Something flickered across his face, not quite approval but close to it. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. "I am prepared to offer you a proposal," he said. "You will become my betrothed, publicly, convincingly, for a period of no less than 6 months. You will attend every event I require, wear what I provide, speak only what serves our arrangement, and ask no questions about matters that do not concern you. In exchange, I will pay for your mother's care, the finest physicians in the city, medicine that would otherwise be beyond your reach, and a sum of money large enough to secure both your futures long after our arrangement ends." Alina stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Betrothed," she repeated, "to you." "In appearance only," he said, turning to face her. I have no interest in marriage, Miss Hartley, and even less interest in affection. What I require is a woman convincing enough to fool the people who matter, and desperate enough not to ask why." The insult in his words was plain, but so was the truth of it. She was desperate. She had been desperate since her father's death 3 years ago, since the debts came due and the shop closed and every door in the city seemed to shut in her face one after another. She thought of her mother's cough, wet and rattling, growing worse each night. She thought of the physician's careful voice. Weeks, perhaps less. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could choose anyone. A woman from a good family, someone who already knows how to move through the world you live in." "Because you have nothing to lose," he said, "and nothing to gain by betraying me. A woman with a fortune of her own might grow ambitious. A woman with family connections might grow careless with secrets. You have only your mother, and I am the only man who can save her. That makes you reliable in a way no one else in this city could be." The coldness of his logic should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, something in her chest hardened, a resolve she had not felt in months. She thought of the rent overdue, the medicine she could no longer afford, the fear that kept her awake every night listening to her mother's breathing through the thin curtain, waiting for it to stop. "What exactly would I have to do?" she asked. He returned to his desk and withdrew a folded document, sliding it across the polished surface toward her. "You will move into this house within the week," he said. "You will be introduced to society as my intended. You will accompany me to certain events, certain gatherings, where your presence will be required and your silence expected. There is a boy, my son, Julian. He will be told the truth eventually, but for now he too must believe the engagement is genuine." "A son," Alina said, surprised. She had heard whispers of a boy somewhere in the manor, but nothing certain, nothing confirmed. No one spoke of the Duke's family. It was as if the topic itself was forbidden. "He is 11, the Duke said, and his voice changed slightly when he spoke of the boy, a fraction softer than before, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "He is not your concern beyond maintaining appearances. Do not grow attached to him. Do not make promises you cannot keep. This arrangement will end, Miss Hartley, and when it does, you will leave without complication." Alina looked down at the document, the elegant script outlining terms she barely understood, numbers that made her breath catch, sums of money larger than she had seen in her entire life. She thought of her mother's face, pale against the pillow, and the fear that lived behind her mother's eyes even when she tried to hide it. "And if I refuse?" Alina asked. "Then I will find another way to help your mother, if I choose to," he said. "But you will lose the chance to secure her future beyond whatever charity I decide to extend. The choice is yours, Miss Hartley. I am not in the business of forcing anyone into anything. I simply present the terms and let desperation do the rest." The cruelty of his honesty struck her harder than any threat could have. He was not pretending to care. He was not pretending this was anything other than a transaction, cold and calculated, built on her need and his convenience. And yet, beneath the ice in his voice, she thought she heard something else, something buried deep enough that even he might not recognize it. A wound, old and unhealed, hiding beneath all that control. She picked up the pen from his desk before she could talk herself out of it. "I have conditions of my own," she said, surprising them both. "My mother receives the best care available immediately, not after the engagement begins. And I will not lie to your son more than necessary. Children deserve better than being used as pawns in games they do not understand." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, as though reconsidering her, seeing something he had not expected. "Agreed," he said after a long moment. "Your mother's care begins tonight. A carriage will be sent to collect her within the hour." Alina signed her name at the bottom of the page, the ink still wet as she set down the pen. She did not know, in that moment, that she had just stepped into something far larger than a simple arrangement of appearances. She did not know about the enemies gathering in the shadows of the Duke's past, about the wife he had lost, and the vengeance he had spent years building in silence. She did not know that somewhere beyond the manor's iron gates, a man named Edmund Craven was already watching, already waiting, already counting the ways he might use her to destroy everything Alaric Voss had left to protect. All she knew was that her mother would live to see another season, and that the cost of that gift had just been written in her own hand, sealed with a signature she could not take back. Outside, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, deep purple bleeding into black, and somewhere in the depths of the manor, a boy named Julian Voss stood at his window, watching the strange young woman climb into a carriage bound for a life she did not yet understand, feeling, for reasons he could not explain, that everything in his world was about to change. The door slammed before Alina could finish her sentence, and she stood alone in the hallway, staring at the space where Julian Voss had been standing only seconds before. She had tried to introduce herself gently, the way she might approach a frightened animal, but the boy had looked at her with such open hostility that the words had died in her throat before she could offer them properly. "He hates me already," she murmured to herself, smoothing down the new gown Mrs. Ellery had laid out for her that morning, fabric finer than anything she had ever worn, soft against skin used to rough wool and mended seams. "He does not hate you," said a voice behind her, and Alina turned to find Mrs. Ellery watching from the end of the corridor, a stack of linens balanced in her arms. "He hates what you represent. There is a difference, though I doubt it feels like one to you right now." "What do I represent?" Alina asked, genuinely curious. "Change," Mrs. Ellery said simply, and continued down the hallway without further explanation, leaving Alina to wonder at the weight behind that single word. Over the following days, Alina settled into a life so unfamiliar it felt like living inside someone else's dream. She was given a room larger than the entire flat she had shared with her mother, with windows overlooking gardens so meticulously kept they seemed unreal, hedges trimmed into perfect lines, flowers arranged with mathematical precision. She was fitted for dresses in colors she had never been able to afford, taught by a stern instructor named Madame Fontaine how to walk, how to curtsy, how to hold a fork correctly at a table set with more silverware than she knew what to do with. The Duke rarely appeared during these lessons, but when he did, he watched from the doorway with an unreadable expression, offering no praise and little criticism, simply observing as though cataloging her progress the way one might track an investment. Alina found herself both resenting his detachment and, against her better judgment, wanting to earn some flicker of approval from those pale gray eyes. Her mother, meanwhile, had been moved into a private room in the finest physician's care the city offered, and the reports that reached Alina were better than she had dared hope. The coughing had lessened. Color had returned to her cheeks. The physician spoke now of months instead of weeks, perhaps longer with continued treatment, and each time Alina visited, sitting beside her mother's bed and holding her thin hand, she reminded herself why she had signed her name to that document in the first place. It was on her 5th day at the manor that she encountered Julian again, this time in the manor's grand library, a room filled floor to ceiling with books that smelled of leather and old paper. She had gone there seeking solitude, a place to breathe away from the constant instruction and scrutiny, and found the boy curled into a window seat with a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the gardens outside rather than the pages before him. "I did not mean to disturb you," Alina said softly, already turning to leave. "You are not disturbing me," Julian said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "This is your house now too, apparently. I suppose I should get used to sharing it." Alina hesitated then, against every instinct that told her to retreat, crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the window, keeping a respectful distance from the boy. "I am not trying to take anything from you," she said. "I know this is strange. It is strange for me too." Julian's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and assessing in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of his father. "You do not love him," he said. It was not a question. Alina's breath caught. She had not expected such directness from a child, but there was nothing childish about the way Julian studied her, waiting for her answer with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that adults rarely told him the truth. "No," she admitted finally, "I do not love him, I barely know him." "Then why are you here?" Julian asked. "Because my mother is sick," Alina said, deciding that honesty, at least in this moment, was the only path that made sense. "Your father offered to help her in exchange for my presence here. It is a business arrangement, nothing more. I am sorry if that disappoints you." Julian was quiet for a long moment, turning the unread book over in his hands. "It does not disappoint me," he said eventually. "My mother died when I was 6. Everyone who comes here after that pretends they care about my father, pretends they want to be part of this family. At least you are not pretending." The rawness in his voice struck something deep in Alina's chest, a grief so plainly worn despite his attempts to sound indifferent. She thought of her own father, gone 3 years now, and the hollow ache that never quite disappeared no matter how much time passed. "I am sorry about your mother," she said quietly. "Losing a parent is one of the hardest things a person can carry, no matter how old you are when it happens." "You lost someone too," Julian said, watching her closely. "My father," Alina confirmed, 3 years ago. "My mother and I have been trying to survive ever since, which is how I ended up here, agreeing to things I never imagined I would agree to." Something shifted in Julian's expression then, the hostility softening into something more curious, more careful. "Do you actually know how to sew?" he asked suddenly, glancing at her hands. "Father said you were a seamstress before this." Alina smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since arriving at the manor. "I do," she said. "I have been sewing since I was younger than you. My father taught me before he taught me anything else." "Could you teach me?" Julian asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by the question, as though he had revealed something he had not meant to share. "I would like that," Alina said, and meant it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor, and both of them turned to see the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the sight of his son sitting comfortably near the woman he had hired to play a role. Something crossed his face too quickly for Alina to name it, gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. "Julian," he said, "it is time for your studies with the tutor." The boy rose reluctantly, tucking the unread book under his arm, and paused beside Alina's chair before leaving. "Thank you," he said quietly, too quiet for his father to hear clearly, and then he was gone, footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Alina alone with the Duke's watchful gaze. "You should not grow close to him," Alaric said once his son was out of earshot, his voice carrying the same cold precision it always did. "I told you this already. It will only complicate matters when our arrangement ends." "He is a lonely child," Alina said, refusing to back down despite the warning in his tone. "He lost his mother. He deserves kindness, not calculation." "I am aware of what my son deserves," the Duke said sharply, and for the first time, Alina saw something crack behind his composed exterior, a flash of genuine pain quickly suppressed. "You know nothing of what happened to this family, Miss Hartley. Do not presume to lecture me on what my son needs." "Then tell me," Alina said, surprising herself with her boldness. "If I am to live in this house, wear your name, sit beside you at every event you require, do I not deserve to understand what I have walked into? What happened to Julian's mother? Why do you speak of her as though her death was more than illness or accident?" The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Alina thought he might refuse to answer entirely, might simply turn and leave the way he so often did when conversations ventured too close to matters he preferred to keep buried. Instead, he crossed the room slowly and stood near the window where Julian had been sitting only minutes before, staring out at the same gardens his son had been watching without truly seeing. "My wife did not die of illness," he said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that suggested enormous effort. "She was murdered. 3 years ago, on a night I was not present to protect her, in a crime that was never solved, though I know precisely who ordered it and precisely why." Alina's stomach turned cold. "Who?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would not be simple. "The Craven family," Alaric said, and the name came out like a curse, sharp and bitter. "Edmund Craven and I were once business partners, before he betrayed me in ways I will not detail to you now. Our rivalry became something more than business, more than money. My wife's death was his message to me, a warning that he could reach into my life and take what mattered most whenever he chose. I have spent 3 years building the means to ensure he never has that chance again, with Julian or with anyone else I am responsible for protecting. And where do I fit into this? Alina asked, though dread had already begun coiling in her stomach, a sense that she had been given only part of a much larger and more dangerous truth. You are the piece that draws his attention elsewhere, the Duke said simply, turning to face her at last. Edmund Craven watches everything I do. If he believes I have found someone I care for, someone vulnerable, it creates an opportunity, a target he may choose to move against instead of Julian. I will not pretend the risk does not exist, Miss Hartley. I chose you because you have no family beyond your mother, no connections that would make your disappearance from society suspicious, and because I believed, perhaps wrongly, that you would be strong enough to understand the stakes without falling apart. Alina stared at him, the full weight of his words settling over her like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward until she could no longer see the surface clearly. You are using me as bait, she said slowly, testing the words, needing to hear them spoken aloud to believe them fully. I am using you as a shield, the Duke corrected, though the distinction felt thin and cold to Alina's ears. My son's life matters more to me than anything else in this world, more than my own life, more than whatever discomfort this arrangement causes you. If there is a chance that your presence here draws danger away from him even slightly, I will take that chance without apology. And if that danger reaches me instead, Alina asked, her voice barely steady, what then? Am I simply an acceptable loss in your calculations? The Duke did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than any words could have. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier coldness, replaced by something almost like reluctance. I did not choose this path lightly, he said, and I will do everything within my power to ensure it does not come to that. But I would be lying if I told you the risk does not exist, and I refuse to lie to you, Miss Hartley, even when the truth is difficult to hear. Alina sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything he had revealed, the murdered wife, the sworn enemy, the calculated risk she had unknowingly agreed to carry the moment she signed her name to his contract. She thought of turning back, of demanding release from an arrangement that had grown far more dangerous than she had understood, but she thought too of her mother, recovering in a warm room with proper care, a gift she could not repay by abandoning the terms now. I want to know everything, she said finally, meeting his gaze directly. If I am going to carry this risk, I deserve to understand it fully. No more half-truths, Your Grace. If we are going to survive whatever is coming, I need to know exactly what we are facing. Something shifted in the Duke's expression then, a flicker of respect breaking through the careful control he wore like armor. Very well, he said quietly. Come with me. There is a great deal I have not yet told you, and very little time before the Craven family makes their next move. As they walked together toward his private study, Alina did not yet know that somewhere across the city, in a mansion just as grand and far more dangerous, Edmund Craven was already receiving reports of the Duke's new betrothed, already smiling the slow, calculating smile of a man who had just found the opening he had been waiting 3 long years to exploit. The knife came from nowhere, embedding itself in the wooden frame of the study door only inches from where Alina had been standing seconds before. She froze, heart hammering, staring at the blade still trembling from the force of the throw, while the Duke was already moving, already shouting orders to guards who appeared from the shadows of the corridor as though they had been waiting there all along. Search the grounds, he commanded, his voice sharp with a fury Alina had never heard from him before. Now. The guards scattered, and Alina found herself pulled roughly behind the Duke, his body positioned between her and the open window through which the blade had come. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she pressed a hand against her chest as though she could physically hold her racing heart in place. That was a warning, the Duke said, his voice low and tight. Edmund Craven does not attack directly, not yet. He wants me to know he can reach into this house whenever he chooses. Alina's legs felt unsteady beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair, staring at the knife still lodged in the door frame, its blade catching the lamplight in a way that made her stomach twist. How did he know, she asked. I have been here less than a week. How could he already know I exist? He has eyes everywhere, the Duke said grimly, finally turning to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been guilt. Servants who can be bribed, merchants who report what they see, even members of society who owe him favors they cannot refuse. I should have anticipated this happening sooner. I underestimated how quickly he would move. This was the moment, Alina knew, when she should have demanded to leave, should have insisted the arrangement was too dangerous, that no amount of money or medical care was worth a blade thrown through a window mere feet from where she stood. But when she opened her mouth to speak, what came out instead surprised her. "Tell me what I need to know to protect myself," she said. "If I am staying, I want to understand every danger, not just the ones you think I can handle." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his pale eyes, and then he nodded once sharply, as though she had passed some invisible test. "Come," he said. "There is much to explain and less time than I would like." Over the following hour, seated in a study now guarded by 2 additional men positioned outside the door, the Duke laid out the history he had only begun to share earlier. Edmund Craven had once been his closest friend, business partners who had built their fortunes together in the early years, before ambition curdled into rivalry, and rivalry curdled into something far darker. The betrayal that ended their partnership had cost Alaric a significant portion of his fortune. Funds Craven had diverted through schemes so carefully hidden that proving the theft in a court of law had proven impossible. When Alaric moved to expose him regardless, using what influence and evidence he could gather, Craven had responded not through legal channels but through violence. Alaric's wife, Celeste, had been found in the gardens of their previous estate 3 years ago, and though the official report listed the cause as an accident, a fall from the garden terrace, Alaric had never believed it, not for a single moment. "I found the man who did it," he told Alina, his voice flat and controlled in the way of someone who had rehearsed this confession many times in the privacy of his own mind but never spoken it aloud. Before he could be brought to justice, he was found dead in his cell, poisoned, the guards claimed by his own hand, though I know better. Craven does not leave loose threads. He eliminates them. "And Julian," Alina asked quietly, "does he know any of this?" "He knows his mother died," the Duke said. "He does not know the details, and I intend to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. A child should not carry the weight of knowing his mother was murdered, and that the man responsible still walks free, still smiles at him from across ballrooms as though nothing happened at all." Alina's chest ached at the thought of Julian, still grieving, still carrying wounds far deeper than his young age should have to bear, unaware that the danger which had taken his mother might still be circling closer than anyone realized. She thought of the boy in the library, curled into the window seat, asking quietly if she might teach him to sew, and something protective stirred in her chest that she had not expected to feel so quickly for a child who was not her own. "What does he want now?" Alina asked. "If he already destroyed what mattered most to you once, what more could he possibly gain by threatening us again?" "Everything," the Duke said simply. "My title, my influence, whatever remains of my fortune, and most of all my son. Julian is my heir. If something were to happen to me, and Craven found a way to gain guardianship or influence over my estate through Julian, he would finally have everything he originally set out to take. My marriage to you, false as it may be in truth, complicates that plan. It suggests stability, an heir secured through legitimate means, as I did not previously have. It makes me a harder target, but it also, I am afraid, makes you one." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room, and Alina found herself staring at her own hands, remembering the knife still embedded in the door frame down the corridor. The proof that danger was no longer theoretical but immediate, close enough to touch. "I am not asking you to fight his battles," the Duke continued, softer now, watching her carefully. "I am asking you to be aware, to trust the guards I assign to you, to never travel outside these walls without proper escort, and to tell me immediately if you notice anything unusual, no matter how small it may seem. I failed to protect Celeste because I did not believe the danger was as close as it truly was. I will not make that mistake again." Alina looked up and met his gaze directly, searching for something in his expression that might tell her whether to trust this man who had brought her into a world of danger she had never asked for. What she found instead was exhaustion, a weariness that went far deeper than physical tiredness, the look of a man who had spent 3 years carrying a grief and a vengeance too heavy for one person to bear alone. "I will be careful," she said finally, "but I will not hide in this house like a prisoner either. If I am going to live here, I want to understand this world, learn to protect myself rather than simply relying on guards who cannot be everywhere at once." A flicker of surprise crossed the Duke's face, followed by something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Very well," he said. "I will arrange for you to learn some measure of self-defense, discreetly, alongside your other instruction. It is not something typically taught to young women of your position, but given the circumstances, I believe an exception is warranted." Over the days that followed, life at the manor took on a strange new rhythm, one shaped equally by the demands of high society and the quiet, constant awareness of danger lurking somewhere beyond the estate's walls. Alina continued her lessons with Madame Fontaine, learning the intricate dance of aristocratic conversation, the subtle rules governing every glance and gesture at a formal gathering. But now, twice each week, she also met with a stern instructor named Captain Rowan Ashby, a former soldier the Duke trusted implicitly, who taught her how to recognize danger before it arrived and how to defend herself if it ever did. Julian, curious about the sudden addition to Alina's schedule, began appearing at the edges of these training sessions, watching with wide, fascinated eyes as Alina practiced disarming techniques and evasive movements under the captain's careful instruction. Though the Duke had warned her against growing close to his son, Alina found it impossible to maintain the distance he requested, especially when Julian began seeking her out more frequently, drawn by a loneliness that no amount of formal education or dutiful servants could fill. "You are getting better," Julian told her one afternoon, perched on the edge of a bench at the training yard's border, watching as Alina successfully countered one of the captain's practice strikes. "I have a good reason to learn quickly," Alina replied, slightly out of breath, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Someone threw a knife through your father's study window last week. I would rather not be caught unprepared if something like that happens again." Julian's expression darkened, the easy curiosity replaced by something more serious, more knowing than any 11-year-old should possess. "Is it the Craven family?" he asked quietly. Alina froze, exchanging a startled glance with Captain Ashby, who looked equally surprised by the question. "What do you know about the Craven family?" she asked carefully. "More than father thinks I know," Julian said, his voice quiet but steady. "I heard the servants talking once, years ago, about mother's accident, about how it was not really an accident at all. I was young, but I remember enough. I know father blames someone, even if he has never said the name to me directly." Alina crossed the training yard and sat beside the boy, understanding now why he carried himself with such careful watchfulness, why he had regarded her with suspicion the day they first met, testing whether she too might be hiding dangerous truths behind a friendly smile. "Your father is trying to protect you from that knowledge," Alina said gently. "He wants you to have as normal a childhood as possible, despite everything that has happened." "I do not want to be protected from the truth," Julian said, and there was a fierceness in his voice that reminded Alina sharply of his father. "I want to understand what happened to my mother. I want to know who to be careful of. Pretending everything is fine has never made me feel safer, only more afraid of the things no one will explain to me." The honesty in his words struck Alina deeply, and she found herself wondering whether the Duke's careful protection of his son, however well-intentioned, might actually be leaving Julian more vulnerable, more isolated in his fear than an honest conversation ever could. She thought of her own childhood, of the ways her parents had always spoken to her plainly, even about difficult truths, and how that honesty had made her feel trusted rather than sheltered. "I will speak to your father," she said finally. "I cannot promise he will agree, but I think you deserve to know more than you currently do, especially if there is any chance the danger that took your mother might still be circling this family." Julian nodded, a small, grateful expression crossing his face, the first genuine warmth Alina had seen from him since her arrival. "Thank you," he said quietly, and then, after a pause, added something that caught Alina entirely off guard. "I am glad Father chose you, even if it started as pretend. I think you understand this family better than anyone else who has come here before." That evening, Alina sought out the Duke in his study, finding him bent over papers scattered across his desk, his expression tight with concentration and barely restrained frustration. She knocked softly on the door frame, still faintly scarred from where the knife had struck days earlier, and waited until he looked up before speaking. "I need to talk to you about Julian," she said, "about how much he already knows and how much more he deserves to understand." The Duke set down his pen slowly, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the careful, guarded look of a man deciding how much of himself to reveal. "Sit down, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "It seems we have a great deal to discuss, and I suspect you are about to challenge decisions I have held onto for far too long." Alina took the seat across from him, steadying herself for the conversation ahead, unaware that even as they spoke, Edmund Craven sat in his own study across the city, reviewing detailed reports on Alina Hartley's daily movements, her training sessions with Captain Ashby, her growing closeness with young Julian Voss, and smiling the patient smile of a predator who understood that the strongest defenses could always be broken, given enough time and the right pressure applied in exactly the right place. The carriage lurched suddenly, throwing Alina against the door, and outside she heard the driver shout something she could not make out over the pounding of hooves. Across from her, Julian gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles white, eyes wide with a fear he was trying and failing to hide. "Stay down," Alina said sharply, pulling the boy toward the floor of the carriage just as something struck the side of the vehicle with a sound like a hammer against wood. "Whatever is happening, stay low and do not look outside." They had only left the manor to visit a bookshop Julian had been asking about for weeks, a small outing the Duke had reluctantly approved after days of the boy's persistent requests, accompanied by 2 guards and Captain Ashby himself riding alongside the carriage. It was supposed to be simple, ordinary, the kind of small freedom Julian rarely experienced given the constant vigilance that had become their daily reality since the knife through the study window. Now the carriage rocked violently again, and Alina heard Captain Ashby shouting orders outside, the clash of metal against metal, the frantic whinny of frightened horses. She wrapped her arms around Julian, shielding him with her own body as the carriage jolted to a sudden stop, throwing them both against the front wall of the compartment. The door was torn open before Alina could react, and for one terrifying moment she stared into the face of a stranger, a man with cold eyes and a scar running along his jaw, reaching toward Julian with obvious intent. Alina did not think. She acted, driving her elbow into the man's throat with a technique Captain Ashby had drilled into her over weeks of training, and the man staggered backward, giving her precious seconds to pull the carriage door shut and brace it with her own weight. "Julian, get behind me," she commanded, and the boy obeyed instantly, pressing himself into the corner of the compartment while Alina held the door closed with trembling arms, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The fighting outside seemed to last an eternity, though later she would learn it had been mere minutes. Finally, the sounds of struggle faded, replaced by Captain Ashby's voice calling her name, and Alina cautiously released the door, finding the captain's bloodied but determined face waiting on the other side. "Are you both unharmed?" he asked immediately, scanning them both for injury. "We are fine," Alina said, though her voice shook slightly as she said it, "just badly frightened." The guards had captured one of the attackers, a man who refused to speak despite Captain Ashby's stern questioning, his silence itself a confirmation of who had sent him. They returned to the manor immediately. Julian pressed close against Alina's side the entire journey, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the quiet trembling of a child who had come far too close to real danger. The Duke met them at the entrance before the carriage had even fully stopped, his face pale with a fear Alina had never seen him show before. And the moment Julian climbed down from the carriage, Alaric pulled his son into an embrace so fierce it seemed to Alina that he was trying to physically shield the boy from every danger the world had ever posed. "I am fine, father," Julian said, his voice muffled against the Duke's chest, though he did not pull away from the embrace, clinging just as tightly in return. Alaric's eyes found Alina over his son's shoulder, and what she saw there surprised her, an intensity of gratitude so raw it made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight far beyond their simplicity. "Whatever debt existed between us before, it has just grown far larger than I ever intended it to be." "I did what anyone would have done," Alina said, though the shaking in her hands suggested otherwise, the adrenaline of the encounter still coursing through her body. "Not everyone would have thrown themselves against a door to protect a child who is not their own," the Duke said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her ears. "Come inside. We need to speak and Julian needs rest." That evening, after Julian had finally been settled with Mrs. Ellery watching over him, and a physician confirming he had suffered nothing worse than fright and minor bruising, Alina found herself once again in the Duke's study, though the atmosphere between them had shifted in ways she was only beginning to understand. "This cannot continue," the Duke said, pacing behind his desk with barely restrained agitation. "Craven has grown bolder than I anticipated. An attack in broad daylight on a public street with witnesses present. He is no longer being careful, which means he believes his position is strong enough that consequences no longer concern him." "What does that mean for us?" Alina asked, watching him carefully. "It means I need to change my approach," the Duke said, stopping his pacing to face her directly. "I have spent 3 years gathering evidence quietly, building a case that would hold in the eyes of the law rather than resorting to methods as ruthless as his own. But quiet approaches have not stopped him from threatening my son twice now. Perhaps it is time to consider more direct measures." Alina felt a chill at his words, understanding the darker implications behind them. "What kind of direct measures?" she asked carefully. The Duke did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than words might have. "Do not ask me questions you do not truly want answered, Miss Hartley," he said finally. "My priority is Julian's safety, and I will pursue whatever means necessary to secure it." "And what about my safety?" Alina asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "I have been threatened twice now as well, if you count the knife through your study window and today's attack. Do I not deserve to understand what measures you are considering, given that my life is apparently as much at risk as your son's?" Something in the Duke's expression softened slightly, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before he composed himself once more. "You are right," he admitted. "I have been so consumed by protecting Julian that I have not adequately considered the danger you now face because of your association with this family. That is a failing on my part, and I intend to correct it." He crossed the room and stood closer to her than he had ever positioned himself before, close enough that Alina could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the weight of years spent carrying grief and vengeance in equal measure. "I did not expect you to care as much as you clearly do," he said quietly. "When I proposed this arrangement, I saw only a transaction, a useful arrangement between two people with complementary needs. I did not anticipate that you would throw yourself between danger and my son without hesitation, that Julian would come to trust you more deeply in a matter of weeks than he has trusted anyone since his mother died." "I did not expect to care either," Alina admitted, the honesty slipping out before she could stop it. "But Julian is a good boy who has suffered more than any child should have to bear. I could not simply stand by and let harm come to him, regardless of the terms of our arrangement." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale gray eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost much of its usual careful control. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When I brought you into this house, I saw you as a shield, a useful piece in a larger strategy. I did not consider that you might become something more than that, both to Julian and, I am beginning to realize, to myself as well." Alina's heart stumbled at his words, uncertain how to respond to a vulnerability, so unlike the cold, calculating man she had first met in this very room weeks ago. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head slightly, cutting her off. "Alaric," he said, "if we are to survive whatever Craven attempts next, I think we have moved beyond the formality of titles between us, at least when we are alone." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them seemed prepared to name, until the sound of a soft knock at the door broke the tension entirely. Mrs. Ellery entered, her expression grave, carrying a sealed envelope that she handed directly to the Duke without a word. His expression darkened as he read the contents, and when he finally looked up, the warmth that had briefly softened his features had vanished entirely, replaced by cold, controlled fury. "What is it?" Alina asked, alarmed by the sudden change. "An invitation," the Duke said, his voice tight. "Edmund Craven has requested our presence at a masquerade ball he is hosting in 3 weeks' time, extended to me, to Julian." And he added, his jaw tightening further, specifically to you, Miss Hartley, by name. Alina felt the blood drain from her face. "He knows exactly who I am," she said quietly. "He has known since the moment you signed that contract," the Duke said grimly. "This invitation is not a courtesy, Alina. It is a declaration. He wants us in a setting he controls, surrounded by his allies, where he can study you directly, assess whatever weakness he believes he has found in bringing you into this family." "Then we should refuse," Alina said immediately. "Refusing would only delay the inevitable and signal weakness he would exploit regardless," the Duke said. "No, we will attend, but we will attend prepared. I will not walk into that ballroom without every possible protection in place, for Julian, for you, and for myself." Alina nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what lay ahead, though a cold knot of fear had settled permanently in her stomach at the thought of facing the man responsible for so much suffering already visited upon this family. "What do we need to do to prepare?" she asked. The Duke moved to his desk, spreading out papers and beginning to outline a plan even as he spoke, but Alina found her attention drifting to the invitation itself, still lying open on the desk. Edmund Craven's elegant, confident handwriting spelling out an invitation that felt less like a social gathering and more like a battlefield already being drawn, 3 weeks away, where everything they had built to protect Julian and each other would finally be tested against the man who had already taken so much from this family once before. The mask felt heavier than it should have, pressing against Alina's face as she stood at the top of the grand staircase leading into Edmund Craven's ballroom. Watching hundreds of masked guests moving below like a sea of silk and jewels, concealing every true intention beneath painted porcelain smiles. "You look pale," the Duke murmured beside her, his own mask a severe black design that somehow made his sharp features even more intimidating. "Remember, whatever happens tonight, do not leave my side, and do not speak to Craven directly unless I am present." "I remember," Alina said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best efforts to steady it. "Where is Julian?" "With Captain Ashby, watching from a private room upstairs," the Duke said. "He will not be exposed to danger tonight if I can help it, whatever else happens." They descended together, Alina's hand resting on the Duke's arm as convention required, though the touch felt less like performance now and more like genuine reassurance, an anchor in a room suddenly filled with unfamiliar faces and hidden threats. Whispers followed their entrance, masked heads turning to track their progress across the ballroom floor, and Alina felt the weight of every hidden gaze like physical pressure against her skin. He found them within the hour, appearing at Alina's side, while the Duke was momentarily engaged in conversation with another guest, close enough that she startled at the sound of his voice. "Miss Hartley," said Edmund Craven, his mask a golden design that somehow made his smile look even more predatory than it might have bare-faced. "I have heard so much about you. The Duke's mysterious betrothed, plucked from obscurity to charm all of society. You must forgive my curiosity." Alina forced her expression into careful neutrality, remembering every lesson Madame Fontaine had drilled into her about controlling her features in situations exactly like this one. "Lord Craven," she said evenly, I have heard a great deal about you as well. All good things, I hope, Craven said, his tone light but his eyes sharp beneath the golden mask, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. I would not presume to characterize it that way, Alina replied, and something flickered across Craven's expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect for her refusal to play the frightened, deferential role he likely expected from someone of her humble origins. Bold, Craven said, his smile widening slightly. I can see why Alaric chose you. Tell me, Miss Hartley, does he treat you well? Does he confide in you the way a man should confide in the woman he intends to marry? Or do you find yourself, perhaps, kept at a careful distance from certain truths? The question landed with precision, clearly designed to plant doubt, to test whether Alina knew the full history between these two men or whether the Duke had kept her purposefully ignorant. She thought quickly, recalling the captain's advice from her training sessions about maintaining composure under pressure. I find him quite honest, Alina said carefully, perhaps more honest than most men in his position would choose to be. Craven's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, and Alina knew she had answered correctly, denying him whatever satisfaction he had hoped to extract from her uncertainty. Before he could press further, the Duke appeared at her side, his expression carefully controlled despite the tension radiating from his posture. Edmund, he said, his voice cool and measured, I see you have found my betrothed. I trust you are treating her with the respect she deserves. Of course, Craven said smoothly, though the false warmth in his voice did nothing to disguise the malice beneath it. We were simply becoming acquainted. Miss Hartley is quite charming, Alaric, quite unlike anyone you have brought into your life before. I find myself wondering what circumstances led to such an unexpected match. Circumstances that are none of your concern, the Duke said, his voice sharpening despite his obvious effort to maintain civility in the crowded room. Craven laughed softly, a sound entirely devoid of genuine humor. Always so guarded, he said. Very well, I will not press further tonight, but do enjoy the evening, both of you. I have gone to considerable trouble to make this gathering memorable. He melted back into the crowd before either of them could respond, leaving Alina with a lingering sense of dread that settled deep in her stomach, a certainty that his parting words carried a meaning far more sinister than simple hospitality. I do not like this, Alina murmured once he was safely out of earshot. He said he made this gathering memorable. What does that mean? I do not know, the Duke admitted, his eyes scanning the crowded ballroom with growing unease. But we should not linger longer than necessary. Come, let us find a quieter corner where we can speak freely. They had barely moved 3 steps when the first scream erupted from across the ballroom, followed immediately by the sound of shattering glass and panicked shouting. Alina's heart lurched as she turned toward the commotion, watching in horror as smoke began billowing from one of the side rooms, guests scattering in every direction, the elegant order of the masquerade dissolving into chaos within seconds. Julian, the Duke said, his face draining of color as understanding hit them both simultaneously. This is a diversion. He turned sharply, already moving toward the staircase leading to the private rooms where Julian waited with Captain Ashby, and Alina followed close behind, her heart pounding with a fear more visceral than anything the earlier attack on the carriage had produced. They found the upstairs corridor eerily quiet, the chaos below seeming distant and muffled through the thick walls, and Alina's relief at the apparent calm was short-lived when they discovered the door to Julian's private room standing slightly ajar, no sign of Captain Ashby anywhere in sight. Julian, the Duke called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, pushing through the door with Alina close behind him. The room was empty. No, the Duke breathed, his composure cracking entirely for the first time since Alina had known him, panic raw and unfiltered in his voice. No, this cannot be happening again. Alina's mind raced, searching for any clue that might indicate what had happened, and her eyes caught on a folded note left deliberately on the small table near the window. Edmund Craven's elegant handwriting unmistakable even in her panic. Your son is safe for now, the note read. Meet me in the East Garden, alone, Alaric, if you wish to see him again unharmed. Bring Miss Hartley, and there will be consequences you cannot undo." The Duke's hands trembled as he read the note, and Alina watched something break behind his controlled exterior. 3 years of careful vengeance and calculated protection collapsing in an instant beneath the weight of his greatest fear, finally realized. "He has Julian," the Duke said, his voice hollow with dread. "He actually has my son." "We need to think clearly," Alina said, forcing steadiness into her own voice despite the terror clawing at her chest, understanding that panic would serve none of them in this moment. "Where is the East Garden? How quickly can we get there?" "Through the south hallway," the Duke said, already moving, his earlier composure replaced by grim, focused determination. "Alina, listen to me carefully. Whatever happens in that garden, whatever he demands, your safety matters to me as much as Julian's does now. I will not sacrifice you to save him, and I will not sacrifice him to save you. There has to be another way." "There is no time to find another way," Alina said, matching his pace as they hurried through the corridor. "We go together, we assess the situation, and we find a way to bring Julian home safely. That is the only plan that matters right now." They descended a narrow servants' staircase that bypassed the chaos still unfolding in the main ballroom, emerging into the cool night air of the East Garden, moonlight filtering through carefully manicured hedges that cast long, twisted shadows across the path ahead. And there, standing beside an ornamental fountain with 2 armed men flanking him and Julian held firmly by the shoulder, stood Edmund Craven, his golden mask discarded, his true face finally revealed, cold and triumphant in the pale moonlight. "Father," Julian called out, his voice shaking with fear but his eyes fierce with the same stubborn courage Alina had come to recognize in him over the past weeks. "Stay calm," the Duke called back, his voice carrying every ounce of authority he could summon despite the terror Alina could feel radiating from him. "Edmund, let my son go. Whatever quarrel exists between us, he has no part in it." "He has every part in it," Craven said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet garden. "He is your heir, Alaric. The last piece of everything I intend to take from you before this is finished. 3 years ago I took your wife. Tonight I intend to finish what I started, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." Alina felt the Duke tense beside her, watched his hand move instinctively toward the concealed blade she knew he carried beneath his formal coat, and understood in that terrible moment that whatever happened next in this moonlit garden would determine not only Julian's fate, but the fate of everyone standing among the shadowed hedges, caught in the final, deadly convergence of a vengeance 3 years in the making. "Let him go," the Duke said again, taking a slow step forward, his hands raised slightly to show he intended no immediate violence. "This is between us, Edmund. It has always been between us. Julian is innocent in all of this." Craven's laugh echoed coldly across the garden, a sound that made Alina's skin prickle with dread. "Innocent," he repeated. "Was my brother innocent when you had him arrested for crimes he did not commit? Was my family's name innocent when you spread word through every business circle in this city that we could not be trusted? You destroyed everything my family built, Alaric, and called it justice. I am simply returning the favor." "Your brother stole from every investor who trusted him," the Duke said, his voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath it. "I exposed the truth. I did not fabricate it. If you wanted to blame someone for his downfall, you should look to the man who committed the crimes, not the one who revealed them." "Lies," Craven snarled, his composure finally cracking to reveal the raw hatred beneath. "You wanted him gone because he threatened your position, because his success outpaced your own. You have always dressed your ambition in the language of righteousness, Alaric, but I know the truth of who you are." Alina watched the exchange with growing dread, understanding that this confrontation had roots far deeper and more tangled than a simple story of villain and victim. That years of grievance on both sides had calcified into something neither man seemed able or willing to release. But none of that history mattered now, not with Julian trembling in Craven's grip, not with 2 armed men standing ready to enforce whatever violence their master demanded. "Whatever happened between you," Alina said suddenly, stepping forward despite the Duke's sharp intake of breath beside her. "It has nothing to do with an 11-year-old boy who has already lost his mother to this feud. If you truly believe yourself wronged, Lord Craven, prove it is Alaric's cowardice you despise, not your own willingness to harm a child who cannot defend himself." Craven's eyes turned to her, sharp and assessing, a flicker of surprise crossing his features at her boldness. "Miss Hartley," he said slowly, "brave words for a woman with no power in this situation. Do you truly believe your opinion carries weight here?" "I believe that hurting Julian will not give you back whatever you lost," Alina said, holding his gaze despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "It will only prove that everything Alaric has said about you is true." Something shifted in Craven's expression, a flash of doubt quickly suppressed, but Alina had seen it, understood that her words had found some crack in his carefully maintained certainty. Before he could respond, one of the armed men beside him shifted his grip, and Julian, sensing the momentary distraction, twisted suddenly and bit down hard on the hand restraining him. The man cried out, his grip loosening just enough for Julian to break free, and everything happened at once. The second guard lunged toward the fleeing boy, his hand reaching for a blade at his belt, and the Duke surged forward with a desperate shout, too far away to reach his son in time. Alina did not think. She moved on instinct alone, every hour of training with Captain Ashby collapsing into a single, decisive action as she threw herself between the guard's blade and Julian's small, fleeing form. The impact staggered her, a searing pain blooming across her side that stole the breath from her lungs entirely, but she had succeeded, Julian tumbling safely past her and into his father's desperate embrace. "Alina," the Duke's voice tore through the chaos, raw with a horror that seemed to shatter every careful wall he had built around himself over the past 3 years. She sank to her knees, one hand pressed against the wound at her side, feeling warmth spreading beneath her fingers even as the cold night air seemed suddenly, terribly distant. The garden tilted around her, moonlight and shadow blurring together, and somewhere through the ringing in her ears she heard shouting, the clash of struggle, Captain Ashby's voice finally arriving with reinforcements, guards descending on Craven's remaining men. "Alina, stay with me," the Duke was beside her now, his hands pressing frantically against the wound at her side, his composed exterior utterly destroyed, replaced by naked terror as he cradled her against him. "You cannot do this. You cannot leave. Do you hear me? I refuse to accept this." "I am not going anywhere," Alina managed, though her voice came out weaker than she intended, the words costing more effort than they should have. "Is Julian safe?" "He is safe," the Duke said, his voice breaking on the words. "He is safe because of you, because you threw yourself in front of a blade meant for my son without a single moment of hesitation. Why would you do that, Alina? Why would you risk everything for a boy who is not even yours?" "Because he matters," Alina whispered, her vision beginning to blur at the edges, the pain in her side growing distant in a way that frightened her more than the pain itself had. "Because someone needed to protect him, and I could not stand by and watch him die when I had the chance to stop it." The last thing Alina saw before darkness claimed her entirely was the Duke's face above her, tears cutting clear paths through the careful composure he had worn like armor since the day they first met. His voice calling her name with a desperation that sounded nothing like the cold, calculating man who had once described her as merely a useful piece in his strategy against Edmund Craven. She did not see Captain Ashby's men finally overwhelming Craven's remaining guards, forcing him to his knees in the very garden where he had believed himself triumphant only moments before. She did not see Julian, tears streaming down his face, clutching desperately at Alina's motionless hand, begging her not to leave him the way his mother had. She did not hear the Duke's ragged voice ordering guards to fetch the physician immediately, his usual authority replaced by pure, unfiltered desperation, as he lifted Alina carefully into his arms, refusing to let anyone else carry her, as though his own strength alone could somehow keep death at bay. The carriage ride back to the manor passed in a blur that Alina would never fully remember, fragments of sensation breaking through the encroaching darkness, the Duke's voice murmuring words she could not quite understand, his hand never once releasing hers, Julian's frightened sobbing somewhere nearby. And beneath it all, a strange, quiet certainty that whatever happened next, she had done the one thing that mattered most in that terrible moonlit garden. She had kept her promise. Julian was safe. Whether she herself would survive the night remained a question that hung suspended in the darkness closing steadily around her. The manor's familiar gates blurring past the carriage window, as Alaric Voss held the woman who had thrown herself between his son and death itself. Praying with an intensity he had not allowed himself to feel since the night he lost Celeste. That fate would not be cruel enough to take this woman from him as well. Not when he had only just begun to understand how deeply she had already become woven into the fragile, fractured fabric of everything he still had left to protect. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar shadows dancing across a ceiling she did not immediately recognize, and for a long, disoriented moment, Alina could not remember why her body felt so heavy, why every breath sent a dull ache radiating through her side. Then memory returned in a rush, the garden, the blade, Julian's small body tumbling free of danger, and she gasped, struggling to sit up despite the protest of pain that movement caused. "Do not move," a voice said sharply, and a hand pressed gently but firmly against her shoulder, guiding her back down against soft pillows. "You need to rest. The physician says you lost a great deal of blood, and moving too quickly could reopen the wound." Alina turned her head and found the Duke seated beside her bed, his appearance so unlike the composed, immaculate man she had come to know that she barely recognized him at first glance. His usually perfectly arranged clothing was rumpled, dark circles shadowed the skin beneath his eyes, and his expression carried an exhaustion that seemed to reach far deeper than mere physical tiredness. "How long have I been unconscious?" she asked, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears. "2 days," the Duke said quietly. 2 days during which I was not certain you would survive at all. The blade struck deeper than we initially realized. The physician worked through the night to stop the bleeding, and even then, he warned me that fever might still claim what the blade did not." "Julian," Alina said immediately, panic sharpening her voice despite her weakness. "Is he safe?" "He is safe," the Duke assured her quickly. "He has not left the manor since that night, and he has asked after you every hour since you were brought home. I believe he has spent more time sitting outside your door than in his own room these past 2 days." Relief washed through Alina, loosening some of the tension that had gripped her chest since waking. "And Craven," she asked, "what happened to him?" The Duke's expression darkened, though not with the same raw grief she remembered from the garden. "He is imprisoned, awaiting formal charges," he said. "Captain Ashby's men captured him and his remaining guards before they could escape the estate grounds. This time, there will be no convenient accident to silence him before he faces justice. I have ensured his imprisonment is guarded by men whose loyalty I trust absolutely, and witnesses to his crimes that night include half the guests who attended that masquerade, unable now to deny what they saw with their own eyes." Alina absorbed this information slowly, understanding the significance of what he was describing, that after 3 years of careful, frustrated pursuit, the man responsible for Celeste's death and countless threats against this family would finally face consequences for his actions. "It is over, then," she said quietly. "The greater danger is over," the Duke agreed, though something in his tone suggested lingering uncertainty. "But I do not believe I will ever fully release the vigilance these past 3 years have instilled in me. Perhaps that is simply who I have become." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them, and Alina found herself studying the Duke's face more openly than she ever had before, noticing details she had somehow overlooked in the weeks since her arrival at the manor. The faint lines of worry etched permanently around his eyes, the way his hands, usually so still and controlled, now fidgeted restlessly with the edge of his sleeve. "Why are you still here?" Alina asked finally. "Surely there are matters requiring your attention, the aftermath of everything that happened, arrangements to be made regarding Craven's trial." "I could not leave your side," the Duke said, and something in his voice made Alina's heart stumble unexpectedly. "Not after what you did. Not after watching you throw yourself between my son and a blade meant to end his life, knowing you had no obligation to do so beyond whatever sense of duty or care had grown in you during these past weeks. Julian matters to me, Alina said softly. I could not have lived with myself if I had done nothing while he was in danger. I know, the Duke said, and that is precisely why I cannot simply thank you and move forward as though nothing has changed between us. Alina, when I brought you into this house, I told myself I was choosing a shield, a convenient arrangement built entirely on necessity and calculation. I have come to understand, these past days sitting beside your bed, wondering whether you would live or die, that I was lying to myself long before I ever admitted it aloud. Alina's breath caught, uncertain where this conversation was leading, though something in her chest had already begun to hope for an answer she was afraid to name even in the privacy of her own thoughts. What are you saying? She asked quietly. I am saying that this arrangement stopped being merely a transaction for me somewhere in the weeks since you arrived, the Duke said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before, every carefully constructed wall finally crumbling away entirely. I am saying that watching you nearly die in that garden showed me, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much you have come to matter to me, not as a convenient shield against Craven's threats, but as a woman I have come to admire, to respect, and yes, Alina, to care for far more deeply than I ever anticipated when I first summoned you to this house. Tears gathered unbidden in Alina's eyes, the weight of exhaustion and pain, and everything she had endured over the past weeks finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained since first receiving that fateful letter. I did not expect to feel this way either, she admitted softly. I told myself this was simply a business arrangement, a way to save my mother's life and nothing more. But somewhere between teaching Julian to thread a needle and training beside Captain Ashby, and watching you slowly let down the walls you keep around yourself, I stopped believing that was entirely true. The Duke reached for her hand then, careful and gentle in a way that felt entirely different from every calculated gesture he had offered during the early weeks of their arrangement, and Alina did not pull away. When you are fully recovered, he said quietly, I would like to discuss what comes next between us, not as terms written into a contract, but as two people who have found something neither of us expected to find in circumstances neither of us chose willingly. Would you be open to that conversation? I would, Alina said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. A soft knock interrupted the moment, and the door opened just enough for Julian's anxious face to appear in the gap, his eyes widening with relief the instant he saw Alina awake and sitting upright against her pillows. You are awake, he said, his voice cracking with emotion as he rushed into the room, careful not to jostle her injured side as he threw his arms around her in an embrace far more desperate than any he had offered since her arrival at the manor. I was so frightened. I thought you might not wake up at all. I am not so easy to lose, Julian, Alina said, returning his embrace as gently as her injury allowed, her own eyes damp with unexpected emotion. I promised I would protect you, and I intend to keep that promise for a long time yet. The Duke watched his son and the woman who had risked everything to save him, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience fully since losing Celeste 3 years ago, the quiet, tentative hope that perhaps, despite everything this family had suffered, healing and happiness remained possible after all. Outside, beyond the manor's walls, Edmund Craven sat in his prison cell, still nursing the bitter fury of his failed vengeance, unaware that even now, evidence continued mounting against him from witnesses willing at last to speak the truth, and that the trial awaiting him would finally deliver the justice that had eluded Alaric Voss for 3 long, painful years. But inside the manor, in a bedroom warmed by afternoon sunlight, and the presence of 2 people who had come to matter more to each other than either had anticipated, a different kind of victory was quietly taking shape, one built not on vengeance or calculation, but on the unexpected, undeniable bond forged between a desperate seamstress, a grieving boy, and a Duke who had finally allowed himself to hope again. The courtroom fell utterly silent as the judge rose to deliver his verdict. And Alina, seated between Julian and the Duke in the front gallery, felt her hand tighten around Julian's fingers as the weight of the moment settled over the entire chamber. 3 weeks had passed since the night in the garden. 3 weeks of careful recovery and careful preparation for a trial that would finally determine whether Edmund Craven faced justice for the crimes he had spent years believing himself untouchable enough to commit. Edmund Craven, the judge intoned, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom, on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, attempted kidnapping of a minor, and the orchestrated death of Celeste Voss 3 years past. This court finds you guilty on all counts. A murmur rippled through the gathered spectators, and Alina watched Craven's face from across the room, his expression finally cracking beneath the weight of consequences he had spent years believing he could avoid indefinitely through wealth and careful manipulation. The evidence gathered from that final confrontation in the garden, combined with testimony from witnesses at the masquerade and evidence Captain Ashby's men had uncovered during their investigation into Craven's estate, had proven overwhelming, undeniable even to a judge who had once counted Craven among his social circle. You will spend the remainder of your natural life imprisoned for these crimes, the judge continued, and as guards moved to escort Craven from the courtroom, his eyes found Alaric across the crowded chamber, a final, bitter glare carrying 3 years of hatred that would now be contained behind prison walls rather than free to threaten anyone else. "It is finished," the Duke murmured beside Alina, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something more complicated, the closure of a chapter that had defined so much of his life for so long, now finally, truly closed. Julian leaned against Alina's side as they exited the courthouse together, the autumn sunlight bright and clean after the heavy atmosphere of the trial. And for the first time in longer than Alina could remember, she felt the boy's shoulders relax entirely. The constant, low-grade tension he had carried since his mother's death finally beginning to ease. "Is it really over?" Julian asked quietly, looking up at his father with an expression caught between hope and lingering disbelief. "It is really over," the Duke confirmed, resting a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "Craven can no longer threaten this family. You are safe, Julian, truly and completely safe, in a way you have not been for 3 years. The weeks that followed brought a quiet, gradual transformation to Voss Manor. The constant vigilance and careful caution that had once permeated every hallway slowly giving way to something lighter, something that almost resembled ordinary happiness. Julian's tutors reported renewed enthusiasm in his studies, his earlier guardedness softening into the natural curiosity and warmth of a child, finally free from the weight of fear he had carried for far too long. He spent hours in Alina's company, learning to sew as he had originally requested, though their lessons increasingly gave way to simple conversation, laughter echoing through rooms that had once felt cold and formal. Alina's mother, fully recovered under the continued care the Duke had provided, moved into a small cottage on the manor's grounds at Alina's request, close enough that mother and daughter could see each other daily, an arrangement that brought Alina a peace she had not felt since her father's death years before. Margaret Hartley, delighted to find her daughter not only alive and thriving, but genuinely cared for by the family that had once seemed so intimidating from a distance, quickly became a beloved presence in the household, her warm laughter often heard drifting through the manor's gardens as she spent afternoons with Julian, teaching him things his formal tutors never thought to include in his education. It was on a crisp autumn evening, months after the trial had concluded, that Alaric found Alina in the manor's library, curled into the same window seat where she had first spoken honestly with Julian all those months ago, watching the last light of sunset paint the gardens in shades of gold and amber. "May I join you?" he asked, and Alina smiled, making room for him beside her. "I was just thinking about the first time I sat in this room," she said, as he settled beside her. "Julian was so guarded then, so certain I was simply another stranger passing through his life without ever truly staying." "He adores you now," the Duke said softly. "He asked me just yesterday whether you might consider staying permanently, not as a temporary arrangement but as something lasting. I confess, I have been wondering the same thing myself, though I have struggled to find the right words to ask you properly. Alina turned to face him fully, her heart quickening at the seriousness in his expression, so different from the cold, calculating man who had first proposed their arrangement all those months ago in this very manner. "What are you asking, Alaric?" she said gently, using his given name with an ease that had grown natural between them over the recovering weeks. "I am asking whether you would consider making this arrangement permanent," he said, reaching for her hand with a tenderness that still occasionally surprised her, coming from a man who had once guarded every emotion so carefully. "Not because a contract requires it, not because circumstance forced us together, but because I have come to love you, Alina Hartley, more deeply and more genuinely than I ever believed myself capable of feeling again after losing Celeste. I love the courage that led you to throw yourself in front of a blade meant for my son. I love the patience you have shown him, the warmth you have brought back into this house, and the honesty you have never once withheld from me, even when honesty was difficult to hear." Tears gathered in Alina's eyes, though this time they carried none of the fear or exhaustion of her earlier days at the manor, only the overwhelming warmth of a happiness she had never dared to imagine finding when she first signed her name to that fateful contract months before. "I love you too," she said softly, the words feeling both surprising and entirely natural as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "I did not expect to, and I certainly did not plan for it, but somewhere between teaching Julian to thread a needle and standing beside you through everything Craven put this family through, I fell in love with you, Alaric, completely and without reservation." He kissed her then, gentle and unhurried, sealing a promise far more genuine than any document either of them had signed before. And when they finally parted, Alina found Julian standing quietly in the library doorway, having apparently witnessed the entire exchange, a wide, unguarded smile spreading across his young face. "Does this mean you are staying for real now?" he asked, hope shining plainly in his eyes. Alina laughed, warmth spreading through her chest at the boy's obvious delight. "Yes, Julian," she said, "I'm staying for real now." He crossed the room and threw his arms around them both, and Alaric, laughing for what felt like the first time in years, pulled his son and the woman who had changed everything about his life into an embrace that held within it 3 years of grief, finally beginning to heal. A family broken by tragedy slowly rebuilding itself into something whole again. Their wedding took place the following spring, a celebration far grander and far more genuine than the false engagement that had first brought them together, attended by servants who had watched their relationship blossom from careful arrangement into true devotion, by Margaret Hartley, who wept happy tears throughout the entire ceremony, and by Julian, who stood proudly at his father's side, no longer the guarded, grieving boy who had first regarded Alina with suspicion in this very manner, but a child finally, fully secure in the knowledge that he was loved, protected, and surrounded by a family that would never again be threatened by the shadows of the past. Years later, when Julian would tell the story of how his father's convenient arrangement transformed into the truest love he had ever witnessed, he would always begin the same way, with a knife thrown through a study window, a woman who chose courage over safety, and a family that learned, against every expectation, that sometimes the pawns we choose for calculated purposes become the very people who teach us how to live again, how to love again, and how to finally truly heal from wounds we once believed would never close. 5 years passed, and Voss Manor no longer resembled the guarded, shadowed estate Alina had first entered as a frightened young woman carrying nothing but desperation, and a mother's fading breath as her only reason for staying. The gardens, once trimmed with mathematical precision to satisfy a household governed by grief and vigilance, now bloomed with a wilder, warmer beauty, flowers planted by Alina's own hands mixing freely among the formal hedges, a small rebellion against the cold order that had once defined this place. Julian, now 16, had grown into a young man who carried himself with his father's quiet strength and Alina's open warmth in equal measure, his earlier guardedness long since replaced by a confident kindness that made him beloved among the household staff, and respected among the tutors who continued shaping his education toward the responsibilities he would one day inherit. He often spoke, when pressed by curious visitors, of the woman who had thrown herself between him and danger in a moonlit garden years before, never with the careful distance of someone reciting old history, but with the genuine warmth of a son speaking about a mother he had chosen, and who had in turn chosen him completely. Alina and Alaric had welcomed a daughter into their family 2 years into their marriage, a bright-eyed girl named Rosalind who possessed her mother's sharp wit and her father's careful, watchful eyes, though thankfully none of the caution that grief had once carved into Alaric's expression before Alina arrived to soften it. Rosalind adored her older brother fiercely, following him through the gardens with the same determined curiosity that had once led Julian to seek out Alina in the manor's library. And Julian, remembering his own childhood loneliness before Alina's arrival, made certain his little sister never felt the isolation he had once known. Edmund Craven remained imprisoned, his name rarely spoken within the walls of Voss Manor, except on the occasions when Julian, older now and better equipped to understand the full weight of what his family had endured, asked his father careful questions about those difficult years. Alaric answered honestly, as he had promised himself he always would, believing firmly that his son deserved truth rather than protective silence, though he was careful to balance honesty with reassurance, reminding Julian always that the danger had passed, that the family was safe, and that nothing remained of Craven's influence beyond the confined walls of the prison that would hold him for the remainder of his days. Margaret Hartley continued living in her cottage on the manor grounds, her health fully restored, spending her days tending a small garden of her own and delighting in the grandchildren who visited her daily, filling her later years with a joy she had feared she would never live long enough to experience. She often told visitors, with the particular pride of a mother who had watched her daughter transform circumstance into triumph, that Alina had always possessed a courage far greater than she herself had ever recognized, courage that had ultimately saved not only her own life through that fateful contract, but had saved an entire family from the darkness that had threatened to consume it entirely. Captain Rowan Ashby remained a trusted presence at the manor, though his role had shifted gradually from protector against imminent danger to something closer to a beloved family friend, teaching Rosalind now the same careful self-defense techniques he had once taught her mother, insisting gently that every member of this family, regardless of age or position, deserved the confidence and capability to protect themselves and those they loved. On quiet evenings, Alina and Alaric often found themselves in the library, where their relationship had first begun to shift from calculated arrangement into genuine affection, sitting together in comfortable silence as the sun set beyond the gardens, watching their children grow into the kind of people neither of them had dared imagine possible during those first fearful weeks after Craven's initial threats. "Do you ever regret it?" Alaric asked one such evening, several years into their marriage, watching Alina's face carefully in the fading golden light. "The contract, the danger, everything that arrangement cost you before it became something real." Alina considered the question seriously, remembering the fear that had gripped her the day she first received that mysterious letter, the desperation that had driven her to sign her name to terms she barely understood, the terror of that moonlit garden and the blade that had nearly ended everything before it truly began. "Never," she said finally, taking his hand in hers. "Every difficult moment led me here to this family, to Julian and Rosalind and to you. I would walk through every danger again if it meant arriving at this same place, this same life, surrounded by the people I love most in this world." Alaric raised her hand to his lips, a gesture that had become familiar over their years together, but had never lost its tenderness. "I think often of the man I was before you arrived," he admitted quietly, consumed entirely by grief and vengeance, so certain that love had died alongside Celeste that I never imagined feeling it again. "You taught me otherwise, Alina. You taught this entire family that healing remains possible, even after the deepest wounds, if only we allow ourselves the courage to hope again." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter drifting through the library windows, Julian and Rosalind chasing each other through the gardens in the fading light, their joy uncomplicated and free in a way that would have seemed impossible in this house years before, when fear governed every hallway and every carefully guarded conversation. Alina watched her children through the window, then turned back to her husband, love and gratitude swelling in her chest for a life she had never anticipated finding when she first climbed into that unmarked carriage bound for Voss Manor, uncertain and afraid, carrying only the desperate hope of saving her mother's life. She had arrived believing herself merely a pawn in someone else's careful strategy, a piece to be used and discarded once her usefulness expired. Instead, she had found a family worth protecting with everything she possessed, a love that had grown from calculated arrangement into something true and lasting, and a courage within herself she had never fully recognized until the moment she chose to step between a blade and a child who was not yet, but would soon become, entirely her own. The story of the seamstress who became a duchess, who threw herself into danger to save a grieving boy and found love in the process, would be told for generations within the walls of Voss Manor, not as a tale of tragedy overcome through vengeance or violence, but as a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, courage and genuine kindness possess the power to transform pawns into partners, strangers into family, and calculated arrangements into the truest kind of love. The kind built not on convenience or necessity, but on the unshakable choice to protect and cherish one another, no matter the cost. And in the golden light of that peaceful evening, surrounded by the family she had helped heal, and the love she had never expected to find, Alina Voss understood, finally and completely, that every difficult choice she had made since that first fateful letter had led her exactly where she was always meant to be.